Well, what about going with Nancy?
I don't know how
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
manage I can do, but I'm talking about the view on the screen.
2 minutes to allow more people time to come in.
So, Nancy, if I come in with you, does that make any difference? Because we can't share the camera.
If I pull the computer back, maybe.
I'll come down there. What room are you in?
In a CLC room.
Okay.
As you can see, we're getting ourselves together on this end. So while people continue to join the webinar, the numbers are rising pretty quick. We will get ready, and of course, we've got 2 stars joining us. Once they do, we'll begin. Nancy, I can't see anything from your camera anymore. There you go. Wonderful. I'm so happy you guys are in the same building. That's great. All right, so everyone, we want to get started. Thank you so much for your patience while we figure out all this technical stuff. And we're just going to forge ahead, and I'm so grateful that everyone's here for us to begin. So good afternoon and welcome to the webinar today. It's called Continuing the Conversation on Oppression, Racism, and Health Inequities. My name is Ruth Colon Wagner, and I'm the Director of Training and Development with NIAPRS, the New York Association of Psychiatric Rehabilitation Services. So I want to do some quick housekeeping issues. The first is about the continuing education hours that we're affording you with this webinar. So it's going to be 1 CE hour, and we're doing that for social workers, mental health counselors, CPRP, and CRCC. Now, if you're interested in any of those CE hours, the requirement is that you need to complete the evaluation at the end, identify yourself on that evaluation, of course, evaluate your experience, and indicate which CE hour you're looking for based on your licensure. So we would need all that information. Now, I do ask everyone, whether you're asking for CE hours or not, to please fill out the survey, because we really take that information back, and it's definitely going to help us as we plan the second webinar that is scheduled for March, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Also want to let you know that everyone on the call right now is on mute, and that's to reduce background noise, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. We do, and you will see a question box on the right-hand side panel, and please use that. As you think of your questions, I want you to just pop in there and write it in, and it will start coming onto my screen. And I'm going to save all those so that when it's time for question and answers, our experts on the panel can begin answering questions as soon as possible without waiting time. So with that out of the way, I just want to briefly talk about what our partnership has been doing. So since last year, 2018, NIAPRS, along with our partners at CCSI and at the McSilver Institute, we came together with one common purpose. And that was essentially to bring the provider community together to have these what we call difficult conversations on the impact of racism on health and wellness. And we held a one-day conference last summer, and that was entitled Confronting Health Inequity, Let's Get Comfortable with Being Uncomfortable. I hope many of you on our webinar today were there for that conference and those difficult conversations. And I'm actually going to ask each of you to take 10 seconds and just look at your right-hand side panel and raise your hand if you were there last year in the summer. It was July, wasn't it? July last summer. All right, so you would open attendee and then raise your hand there. So we're going to be looking at that information. I ask you to please do that. We're really interested to see how many people are returning. So we are proud to have the following people share their experience with us last summer. And that was Ruth Shim, who was our keynote, and she was from the University of California. Karen Elam, Melanie Fucus, Lenora Reed-Rose, that we have her on our panel today, Pablo Sadler, and Raul Vasquez. And the reason we had these particular people join us was because they each are experts in their field. And on top of that, they each have pushed the envelope in their respective fields and their sphere of influence to be able to make a difference and make the changes to see some positive change. So that was a wonderful event, one-day event. This is the follow-up. And so when we were there, we discussed some deep-seated issues and had those hard conversations about racism and its impact on health and well-being. We explored what's in our control and what wasn't. It's important to know what is and what isn't. And then we also talked about what we'd like to see changed. So at that summer conference, it really was very well represented in terms of the stakeholders of the community. We had stakeholders, we had providers, we had administrators, we had managers, we had peer staff, we had clinicians, we had family members, and we had people who access services as well as state organizations. So I'm hopeful that they are all here on the line today. So we thank you all so much. Now, in our efforts to address the impact of racism and social ills, you know, that was never going to end at our one summer conference. So today, this first webinar is the second part of that, and we're going to have a third and a fourth. And so in March, what we're going to do is have our follow-up. Actually, before I get to March, today we're going to do a deeper dive. And so what you see in front of you is our panel. And we decided that we are continuing the conversation. Those hard conversations that we started last summer, we're going to continue them. So we didn't want to just give you a slide deck and, you know, have these invisible people talking to you. So we wanted to really have this be a conversation between the panelists, and to the greatest extent possible, we want to include you in that through the question and answer. So I want to introduce to you the panel. We've got Lenora Reed-Rose and Nancy Sung Shelton from CCSI. And they're actually both there together on the same screen. And then we have Dr. Jim Rodriguez of the McSilver Institute and myself, Ruth Colon Wagner of NIAPRS. So Lenora, Nancy, Jim, thank you for your knowledge. Thank you for your leadership in this important initiative. And now I'm going to pass it along to Lenora, who's actually the moderator, who's going to moderate these conversations for us. Lenora, thank you.
And thank you very much, Ruth. I just want to acknowledge our continued partnership with Coordinated Care Services in CCSI, NIAPRS, and the McSilver Institute in this very important journey. And today, as such, we are going to be, as Ruth mentioned, we will be continuing our conversation along that journey. So my esteemed panelists, I'm really pleased to be having this lead in this conversation with you guys. We're going to start out by looking on more from an overview perspective. Today, we're going to be getting deeper into what the meanings are. You know, we have these words: racism, we have inequity, we have cultural competence, we have person-centeredness, there are a lot of these words that, you know, we interchange them, we use them interchangeably, and very often they mean specific things. So I'm going to ask Jim, will you lead off this conversation in sharing with us your definitions or the definitions that you have used or kind of mean so much more to you? I know we all can go to Google, right? We can all Google and find a definition and say, oh, this is it. But could you just give us the definition that means more to you, that speaks to you, and the one that you use most?
Well, as you said, Lenora, the terms that sort of go around and oftentimes are used interchangeably but are very different are like cultural competence and anti-oppressive practice and anti-racist practice. And I think one of the things that we need to understand is that in order to overcome health inequities, we actually need all of those things, but they are very different. So from my perspective, cultural competence really has to do with building awareness and knowledge about the role that culture plays in how participants and providers communicate, and how participants view health and wellness and illness, and using that knowledge to increase access and improve the quality of care. So cultural competence has to do more with understanding, again, communication, beliefs, perspectives on things. Anti-oppressive practice is really focused much more on power and the influence of power and privilege specifically. And it's an approach that understands and focuses on the importance of power and dismantling any forms of inequality. And oftentimes primarily socioeconomic inequality, but of course there are many types of inequality by race, gender, sexual orientation, ability level, so on and so forth. And so in many ways, again, anti-oppressive practices is looking at dismantling inequality in all its forms. And then anti-racist practice is focused very narrowly and specifically on challenging the values and structures and behaviors that perpetuate systems of racism. And so when I think about how to dismantle inequalities in healthcare and increase equity, it's really a combination of those things. What they all have in common from my perspective is that they require that organizations and systems and individual providers reflect and take a good hard look at themselves in the mirror and reflect again on the policies, procedures, and practices that they use to make sure that they're aligned with cultural competence, anti-oppression, and anti-racism.
Thank you so much, Jim. Your very thoughtful response to my question. Nancy, I know in your work at CCSI and in your personal experiences that you have done a lot of work in this area as well. And if we kind of extend Jim's definitions, how can you bring that more to focus on some of the similarities?
Well, I think simply put, all terms are a matter of social justice and human rights. I mean, it's about the shared goal of dignity and respect for all. Each practice impacts the other. So when you think about cultural competence, there's a notion that anti-oppressive practice and anti-racism fall under that umbrella of cultural competence. As you mentioned, there are several terms that fall under the umbrella. You have culturally responsive, culturally sensitive, cultural humility, linguistic competence. Then we can also add anti-oppressive practice as well as anti-racist approaches. So we think about that, cultural competence is more of a formalized operationalization of policies, attitudes, practices, procedures, structures, and anti-racism practices and anti-oppressive practice help to facilitate achieving cultural competence within an organization.
So you see this cultural competence as that overarching umbrella.
That's how I feel.
That everything we can kind of scoop everything up in that bucket.
Yes.
Yeah, but they're so different, and I find a lot of times when we speak of cultural competence that very often I don't hear folks speak about anti-oppressive practices or anti-racism and sometimes actually it could seem a little light for me in that area, so we never quite get to it.
I agree. I think it's just because the fact that it's a relatively new term, although the the idea behind the conversation in its early iterations of cultural competence was to address racism, discrimination, and those different unfortunate practices that impede our ability to really provide quality service delivery in an equitable fashion for all. So the unfortunate dynamic of putting everything under an umbrella, some things may get lost in translation or diluted in the process, but it's just because I think there's so many terms that are thrown out in the world, and people think that, for example, cultural humility does not necessarily equate cultural competence. It is a component of cultural competence, and just having to make sure people understand the difference. So yes, it's great to categorize everything under that grand umbrella of cultural competence, but each one of those different terms and practices are integral pieces to achieving cultural competence within an organization or an individual.
Excellent, thank you. And Ruth, at last you mentioned in your opening remarks about the workshop or the day's conference that the partnership had in Albany in July. And certain themes came out. And I'm just wondering if, based on what both Nancy and Jim shared with us, could you see where folks were still kind of questioning in the evaluation what it means to them? Because I know we came together to do the tough conversation. Did you think we get there, or the questions are still lingering?
We can't hear you, Ruth.
All right, how's that?
Thank you.
I had muted myself, so I'm not making any noise, and then of course you can't hear me. So what I did was just take that information, and so there were some outcomes from there, but let me look in terms of tying it to this. There was, there was program creation, that was talking about funding, and then we're talking about cultural competency and anti-oppressive practices, and then the discussion about what is an individual practitioner's work that needs to happen, and then what is an organization's work that needs to happen. And so when I think about, thinking about what you just added, Nancy, what I think about in terms of these three practices, I actually sort of lump them into two categories. And that was part of my group's conversation last summer. And it's essentially saying cultural competence is seen as cultural humility, yes, but taking in the information from the other person. So that is when you take into account person-centered care, and you're eliciting the information to best know how to assist that person. And that's sort of that really one-on-one work. But then when you talk about these grand social issues, anti-oppressive practices, and anti-racist, of course, we can't do that on an individual practitioner level as successfully or at the impact that an organization can do that. And so what we talked about also were organizations. Are their goals to be culturally competent, or are their goals to be an anti-racist organization? And so one is fairly passive and one is really powerful.
That's deep. That's very, very deep. And I know when we meet again in March or May, when we do have our next webinar, we're going to go deep diver into that as to what this means on that deeper level. For now, though, what I'm hearing is that we have these very overarching, the umbrellas, we have these these concepts, we have these definitions, and we need to be able to have conversations around them so we can have a better understanding, but also what do we do with them? I can begin to spout from now till tomorrow that I'm anti-racist or I'm the cultural competence queen, but what does that mean to somebody else? And how then will these be operationalized? And, there are things that get in the way. There are many things that kind of stop us from having these kind of conversations. It makes it very difficult for individuals, and very often I'm asked, so what do I do? What do I do now? How do I ask this? How I don't want to upset anyone. So what do you think? I want us now to talk about or focus a little on what impedes this dialogue. What is it? What are the barriers that really get in the way that stops us from having the really true tough, and it doesn't have to be tough, just have the conversations so they're meaningful and people can leave with something. So, Ruth, I'm going to ask you, what do you do to have these hard conversations with the hard discussions with staff? Mm-hmm. What can someone do? Because I can hear folks asking, okay, it's good. We hear the definition, we get it. How do we then have the conversation with our staff?
We have to start with the understanding that there's implicit bias, period. We are part of society, and society is us. So we either act within our privilege or we act outside of that. I mean, that's how I feel it's such deep-rooted in our society. So we need to actively engage our staff in these conversations, right? We talked, and practitioners were there last summer, and practitioners are on the line. So people are becoming aware that this is hard, but it needs to happen. So if we're going to actively engage these practices, the anti-oppression and anti-racism, we have to engage all the staff. Yes, the administrators who are working on strategic planning and how this affects outcomes and how they can improve outcomes. Yes, it's all important. But the management, the people who supervise the line staff, and of course the line staff, and to have those ongoing conversations. Number one, to understand our own beliefs. Where are we coming from? Why do I believe what I believe? And then as the gatekeepers of services in society, which we all are, for us to understand that we need to do better. We talked about last summer the social determinants of health, and obviously we all know the disparities in the societies where people of color live. And so what can we do better? Constantly have that conversation. So I may not be able to impact if a person can have fresh greens and fresh fruit, but I can improve the quality of services that I, as an individual practitioner, provide. And my organization can improve and give me the skills that I need through training so I could provide that service. But then as an organization, is my voice valued? So for an organization to value the voice of the people receiving services, of the line staff, of the managers, and take that and make this societal shift. Make a stance, have a goal, let the community know who you are. So I think that's what you need to do, and be humble and curious at all times.
I love curious. Curious is my middle name. I love curious. So Ruth, I love the fact that what I'm hearing is that there has to be some way to further develop your staff so that they can then begin to not just have the conversation, but to engage those who they serve so they can get equitable care. The thing that keeps bumping, you're talking, I'm saying to myself, but I'm not a racist. Why do I need to? That's very often some of what you hear. I'm not a racist. I have a lot of Black friends. I love Lenora to death. She and I do kumbaya very often. So either of you guys, Nancy or Jim, would you like to respond to when you're trying to have that conversation with staff and staff begins to more or less, pronounce that they're not racist. So you close your ears and you walk out of that great meeting laughing, hugging, but nothing happens. Mm-hmm. How do you respond to someone who claims that they're not a racist? Well, and will not hear the conversations as a result of that, will not be open to conversations as a result of that?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that racism is a complex interplay of individual beliefs, shared values and ideologies, and institutional structures. One of the things you want to think about when you're trying to make the case about racism in general before you personify it is that how does it play out in the world? So we talk about disparities, we talk about inequities, and we can talk about where you live, for example. And it's not just where you live geographically, it's where you live within your skin. And what does that mean? So you'll see Black men dying at an earlier life span than our white counterparts. You see infant mortality at higher rates for Black children than our white counterparts. You see a wealth gap where you have white families' net worth 10 times higher than Black families. You see achievement gaps where our white students are outpacing our Black and brown students. So when you see that information and that data where it's in your face, it's irrefutable, the data speaks the truth, however we spin it, the essence remains the same, that certain people are suffering. And why are they suffering? Because of racism. And so when you think about that, a lot of people want to think that racism means that you're out there overtly and blatantly saying inappropriate things and offending people. You have a notion of certain groups that are out there hurting others in a horrible fashion. But racism could just be simply the fact that you are enjoying your privilege and you're ignoring the effect or impact of who you are as a person and on other people. And racism, simply defined, is the fear of difference. The fear of difference. And what does that mean for you? Well, my status quo is very comfortable. So for me to have to care about you, that means I have to give up my comfort.
Yes, I know that.
So when you want to talk about it, I think that we talk a lot about implicit bias, biases are, and how do you manage them? We are rather unfortunate, but biases serve a purpose. So what you do about them, we're merging your own personal implicit bias.
Oh, I love that.
So that's
you chime in on that.
100% with everything Nancy said in terms of how it does get complex. I was looking at a recent study by Winthrop University looking at Black Southerners. They asked this question in two ways. They asked the question about privilege, and then they asked the question about barriers. And so in essence, the privilege is, do whites carry more privilege than Blacks? And when you ask that question, 92% of Blacks agree with that statement. 50% of whites agree. And actually, they also asked those who believe in the Confederate flag as well, percent of them agreed with the idea of white privilege. When they asked the question, are there structural barriers that keep people of color behind? The answers change. Actually, when the question is asked that way, 85% of Blacks believe that, 71% of whites, so 20% more whites agree with that. And actually, those who believe in the Confederate flag also increased by 20% to 56%, believing that there are barriers. And so I think some of this has to do with how we approach the discussions. And on the one hand, Nancy's absolutely right that folks do have to be able to accept their privilege and own it. On the other hand, what we see is that oftentimes the way in which we ask the questions and the way in which we engage in the conversations can make a big difference in how those conversations play out. And it's interesting too, because I think the other thing that Nancy said that was very revealing and very important to understand is, yes, when you are able to share the data and the mounds of data that look at, again, the inequalities that exist in society by race, on income level and education levels and poverty levels and so on and so forth, the data is irrefutable. And also the growing data on the impact of things like microaggressions, right? The different ways in which racism today looks, the impact of microaggressions, again, irrefutable evidence that those microaggressions have severe impacts on mental health of people of color and people of marginalized groups in general. So the data is there. And I think that data is very helpful with regards to helping people identify and understand, again, the barriers that exist. I think the trick is, or the challenge is, in folks owning their privilege and in order to be able to have that conversation.
So, Jim, I can see the data piece. So I look on the data and I see all these differences. Are you saying that it's because I'm a racist why there are those differences? Or are you saying it's a result of my lack of not knowing how to interpret the data very differently? Or how do I connect that data to me being or me the way I practice? Because I think I can easily look on the data and don't even think anti-oppression, anti-racist. I don't even think cultural competence.
Yeah.
For that matter.
So when I talk about the data, I think you're right on, and it gets at the point that I was trying to make around how do you engage in the conversation. And I think the data to some degree, helps us understand that there is a problem. And as I said, going back to being able to see that barriers do in fact exist, I think that's the easy part to get people to accept.
Right.
I think the question of racism, you know, another way to sort of approach it is, yeah, I mean, it's difficult for people to hear that I'm a racist. On the other hand, I do think that if we're able to show people and demonstrate the fact that we do live in a society where there's an unequal distribution of risk and opportunity in our society by race, which I think most people can wrap their heads around, then the question people have to ask themselves is this: are you going to allow the status quo to continue? Or are you going to do something to change it? Now, oftentimes we then, right, take the next step and saying, well, if you allow the status quo to exist, that is de facto racism, right? And so going back to Nancy's point earlier, right, oftentimes we think about a racist as someone wearing a hood and white robes, but that's not racism today. And I think one of the things that we have to how we redefine racism in our current society is understanding that racism is also reflected in our willingness to accept the status quo.
Yes. And thank you so very much. Nancy, looks like she's burning to say something.
Well, I wanted to just add on to what you said, which was very poignant, Jim, to me, and just basically saying that, you know, recognizing that racism has to do with power dynamics. And so if you are in position of power, you have the power to uplift or oppress. This is plain as day. It's simply defined. And so when you think about it, when you're trying to make the case to an individual who enjoys the status quo to care about something that really doesn't touch them individually or personally or within their sphere, you have to compel them by recognizing, if we study history, we understand that powers shift throughout history. And what ends up happening when powers shift, there are residuals from the previous power structure that are transplanted into the current power structure. So if there are some policies or practices or attitudes or socializations that occur in the previous power structure and they translate into the new space, you might end up being part of the oppressed population, and by you ignoring it or dismissing it or minimizing it, you could be subjecting yourself to your own future victimization. So we have to care, and we can't just assume that because it's not happening to me that it won't.
So, wow, we have to break down the power dynamics. It's all within the power, and it's just whatever between you, Ruth, and Jim. It just seems like a lot of the conversations keep coming back to who is in power, who holds the power. And I often feel that people who have control over data, who analyze the data, who tells the story, are one of the most powerful, because that interpretation or the story, depending on what lens or what information they have, that spin can be very hurtful. And in the end, I know we do know the impact of data, what it does, how money flows, the strategies that are put in place. So we have to begin to think about ways in which we can break down that paradigm from every angle. You know, people think it's the CEO, no, it's from every angle. We really need to then add that to our list of words that we need to begin to get a deeper dive. So guys, I'd say for our next hurrah, we need to add power dynamics to it. So now I want to go into, and thank you guys for this very wonderful responses, on where do we go from here. I know the time is kind of slipping, but you mentioned, tell us if it was Jim or Nancy or Ruth, somebody mentioned microaggressions and how powerful that is in terms of accessing services, or in terms of when people come for services, how they're treated. Can you speak a little bit more to what are microaggressions? How do we identify them? Because for me, I'm thinking, if I say to Nancy, oh, you're so eloquent, you know, where does that fall? And how do you may not be able to answer today, but at least attempt to, how do you how do you catch yourself? And is it only people who are considered quote unquote racist use microaggressive words or have microaggressive tendencies? I know that's a mouthful, but I'd love you all three to respond as you see fit.
Well, I'll start. Well, simply define microaggressions are the everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights. Those little ouch moments that happen, and sometimes it's when they happen in an isolated fashion, it can be easily dismissed by the person who is perpetrating that microaggression. It's what happens when you compile them all together and it starts to form a pattern. You recognize that this is something that is wrong, and it's not just a cultural blunder, that this is a oppressive approach to a person. So I think that recognizing again our own biases that would cause us to behave in that way, and also as a person of color being vigilant in not only recognizing when a microaggression is occurring in your space toward you, and being courageous to speak and say, wait a minute, that didn't feel right, or that didn't sound right, did I misunderstand what you just said, and engage in a conversation. And just kind of going back to what Ruth was saying, one of the things about being curious is helpful in bridging that cultural divide, but it has to be an intellectual curiosity based on respect.
You guys want to jump in and end this conversation?
Ruth, you're on mute.
I really like that you added, Nancy, the intellectual curiosity, because one of the things that we need to do is almost get some of the emotion out of it, because then that overwhelms us all, overwhelms the person that's defensive and upset, saying, I'm not a racist, and it overwhelms the person who's oppressed and who feels a racism against them. And how do you have those conversations? Number one, it's hard to have those conversations with people you know. And then if you're a victim of microaggression, how do you raise those issues? I don't know, maybe I'm asking more questions than I'm giving.
Well,
and those are very great questions, and I think it's Ruth, and the more we ask ourselves the questions, it's the more it gives us pause to think about it. So we may not know all the answers, but it doesn't mean that you don't ask the question.
Yeah, yeah.
And if I may, I think the analogy for me that I often use to help people understand racial microaggressions is actually sexual harassment, right? Because in many ways, people understand that, right? If I say, for example, right, Ruth, you have a beautiful dress on today. You look really amazing, right?
Thank you.
It may not be my intent. But if Ruth says, that makes me feel uncomfortable. I don't like the way you said that. And I hear that and I continue to do it, right? Ruth would be able to come back and say, it's a hostile environment. I actually told him that I didn't, and I didn't like it, and he continued to do it, right? It may not be my intention to sexually harass Ruth, but if I continue to do it and I'm made aware of it and continue to do it, that's sexual harassment. I think microaggressions work in the same way, except that oftentimes with microaggressions, it can get a little bit more complicated because sometimes people may not be willing to or open to, confront someone on microaggressions. But also, I think it also highlights the reason why race can also be so much more difficult to talk about. I think we can wrap our heads around, for example, gender inequality and understanding why sexual harassment works around that. But when it comes to race, it's a lot more difficult for someone to say, that what you said the other day felt like a microaggression. First off, we're not used to using that language in the first place. But secondly, the only other language that you can use to replace it might be felt a little racist or felt. And then you have that difficulty. But again, the analogy is there. And I think, though, that we have to get to the point where we can talk about microaggressions and how they make us feel. And I think the most important part about microaggressions to understand, and the reason why the analogy of sexual harassment is so important, is because, at the end of the day, the intent of the perpetrator is irrelevant. It's the impact, the subjective impact on the victim of the microaggression that is critically important to understand. And those are the conversations we need to be able to be to get to and be more open about having in the workplace, in the therapy room, in life in general.
Yeah, I like that intent and impact, because I think very often, somebody may, roll you over in a car, step on your feet, do whatever it is. The blood is bleeding. It's a little gross example here, but I never intended to do it. And very often we walk away saying because we didn't intend to do it, it shouldn't mean that the person was not impacted. And that impact is for me, it's very powerful, because very often, even from a personal perspective, when things do happen to me, it's also very challenging to engage in that impact conversation, because it's so hard for others to hear that, yes, you may not have intended this. However, I'm bleeding over here. I'm dying over here based on your behaviors or based on whatever it is that's going on. So it's something else that we need to pay attention to. What I do like, one thing that was raised, is that folks of color or marginalized groups have some work to do as well. It's not just those who are in power. So, because how then do you get folks who are marginalized begin to speak about? Because very often when we speak about anti-oppressive practices or microaggressions or racism or anything, and one of those isms, it always appears, or most times, always absolute, no absolute, most times it appears that we're talking to folks of European descent, the European American group. But what is it that folks, marginalized people, need to do? There's one, I think it was you, Ruth, or Prim Nancy, who said, then they need to speak up. People need to speak up. People need to let others know that this is how they're being impacted. How does that play out in the real world? I mean, I can share some of my examples, but how do you see that play out? Because when somebody speaks up, what usually happens?
Well, I've been on this kick lately about words and the power of words. And so like a word that a lot of organizations and individuals in general use is empower. And I really kind of dissected that word, because basically the notion is behind empowering someone is that through your benevolence, usually the person in power, through your benevolence, you're giving me my power back. And so I have been changing the word from empower to activate, because that gives the idea that I have the power existing in me. It just needs to be activated. So to answer your question, Lenora, I think that as people of color, we need to be activated, because when you are oppressed for generations, you may not understand the reality of or the existence of your own personal power. And I think that conversations have to happen in the back room. I don't think they need to happen in the presence of others, because we need to put, just like, have generals have the war room and they plan their strategies before they go out there and fight the battle. The same thing needs to happen with people of color. We need to have a script, because some of us are just nervous and fear, because part of oppression is keeping people in a fearful space. So we practice our script, understand our own internalized racism that has been perpetuated from generations from the residuals of slavery, and recognizing about self-preservation at the expense of our loved ones and other people in our own community. So those really, really critical conversations have to be happening, so that we can arm ourselves with the strength we need to be activated to manifest ourselves as equal partners in the human race.
Yeah. And Nancy, I'm so glad you brought up the issue of internalized racism, because I think this discussion does bring in some other concepts that, again, deepen and really complicate maybe the issue of how we talk about this, because I think that's an important term to understand, right? The other important term that I think is critical to understand in the conversation of the role of people of color is intersectionality, right? So, because intersectionality tells us that we are not merely one aspect of our identity, or like our color or race or ethnicity is only one aspect of our identity. We also have other aspects like our gender, our sexual orientation, our religious background, our ability level, so on and so forth. So that when we think about the issue of the role of people of color in doing this work, it's an understanding that no two people of color, even if they are of the same race, are alike. And so that there are always going to be these intersectional issues in which power, internalized racism, internalized sexism, internalized on and on can be at play in our interactions and communication. So I think that's where it really gets at a deep level in terms of understanding all of our role in, and going back to one of the terms that we talked about earlier, right? All of our role in dismantling oppression and inequality.
Thank you very much, Jim. And I see where Ruth is trying to get in. Okay, Ruth, you're on.
I'm trying to muscle in.
Yeah, there you are. You're on.
All right. So I was thinking about what you guys just said, and it really, really touched me when you talked, Nancy, specifically about activation and the courage and what is that script, because we do need to be prepared for these because they come out of nowhere, right? And so what do? And my fallback in terms of just thinking about, just now thinking about when you mentioned that, was that sort of my social workism kicked in. You know, my profession kicked in, and it's thinking about, well, when I want to get across to someone, I need to share how I'm feeling or how that made me felt. What you just said made me feel this way, as opposed to saying, oh, that sounded like a microaggression. Because now the pressure is towards that person who did X, Y, and Z, instead of saying, this is how I felt as a result of what I heard or what I saw. So to be able to have the growth happen on their end without them closing their ears, because now they feel judged and they get upset.
Yeah, and I think, it's so challenging. It is so challenging to have any of these kind of conversations, but we must have them. And Ruth, one thing I just heard you say is, as a social worker, here is something that you can borrow from your use of all the concepts and skills that you learned there. I also feel that very often there are many skills that are transferable. There are many things, there are many processes, many ways of thinking that we can move from one field to this field. And we usually have folks who are saying, well, tell me what to do. Tell me how do I change it? How do I transform this? And we've done transformation on many other aspects of our life, of our work. And I want to suggest to folks that, you know, dig into your bags. You have a lot of skills in there that you can pull out to help you navigate these challenging conversations. And words that we need to add on, I'm keeping a list of new words that we need to put in so we can actually begin when we have our conversations on definitions and structures. Internalized racism is huge. That is huge. So I think sometime we must spend time on that so that others and individuals and intersectionality from marginalized groups can begin to understand the impact it has on them. Because we have to really begin to peel off all the layers, not just from folks who would be considered racist, but from those who are oppressed as well. So I know the hour is finishing up so quickly. I think it's time for questions. Yeah, I know. So questions. We're going to have some questions now.
Are there any questions relating? Yes, absolutely. You can hear me, right? There are questions in the queue, and probably one of the first ones that's easy to answer is, can you give some examples of microaggression?
Well, for example, my mother is Korean, and my mother has an accent. She's been in the United States for over 50 years, but she still carries her accent. Can you relate, Lenore?
I can relate to that. Okay. I can relate to that.
So I remember as a child one time going to the grocery store, and a person was talking to my mom, and she was speaking to them in English, and they started speaking very loud and very slow. They thought that they were being considerate of her language difference, but it came off as very disrespectful. And my mom ended up saying, I don't speak English well, I'm not deaf. And so in those little things, or for example, I have gone to parent-teacher conferences, and an individual, the teachers in the room came up to me afterwards and say, "Wow, Miss Shelton, you're so articulate." They think it's a compliment, but I interpret it like to think, what would you think I would be otherwise? And why would you say that to me? Would you say that to a white person? You just they walk into a room with the assumption that they would speak well, and why wouldn't you think I would? So little things like that come off as such.
Yeah. Others that are typically used is, and along the same lines, Nancy, others that are typically used is asking someone of color where they're from, or asking someone that looks like, or who's non-white, where they're from, or even in the opposite case of Nancy, an articulate person asking them how they learned to speak the language in many ways. So these are often ways in which we inadvertently send microaggressions. There's also assumptions that we often make. I think, as Nancy is kind of suggesting, equating race with poverty sometimes, and sometimes we assume that people of color come from poverty. And there's all kinds of ways that I think microaggressions can play out, not only in our everyday interactions, but of course in the therapy room as well.
So I'm going to go on to the next question. Thank you all. So Dali asked, I think that organizations often think that having cultural competency is having trainings or doing work to learn about a particular culture is enough, or that they are now culturally competent. What does it look like when an organization is considered culturally competent?
Yeah,
great question,
it's a great question, and it's definitely not enough. Cultural competence really isn't a training. Training and professional development is one small part of it. You have to look on the policies, the practices, the behaviors, the infrastructure, everything that comes together to make that organization. You have to make changes to all of those before you can actually begin to say you've started that journey. Very often people go for one training and they come back, then so what? It's very hard to even practice what you have learned within the system or the organization that you're in. So you have to look on it from every level of the organization and make changes accordingly. I'd say to folks, look on your mission statement, look on your values. What is it that drive you? Look on your staffing, look on what policies you have in place. Look on the outcomes. We speak about the data. You really have to look at all of it. And I'd say a good place for that to start is to do a cultural competence assessment. You know, like anything else, we need to assess where we are to get a baseline, and then figure out what our strengths are, what our strategies for intervention, and where do we need to go. And I must say that when we begin to do those assessments, you will figure out that most organizations, they have something great that they're practicing. So it's kind of nice to elevate those and then move on from that.
And I'll tell you, Lenora, in all those years that we've done this work, I've never met anyone who was culturally competent.
No.
There's no seal of approval for cultural competence because it's a journey and not a destination.
No.
And as dynamics change and trends change and service population changes, you have to be responsive and alert of those trends so that you can best serve them. So there's the notion of becoming culturally competent, my air quotes, culturally competent, it's a goal to achieve.
Yeah, it's always a goal to achieve.
And if I can add, the questioner's comment about defining cultural competence as learning about other cultures is also way too narrow and actually impractical. It is impossible to learn everything you need to know about every culture that you might come across. And even if you did, right, any one individual who is a member of that culture is going to differ from every other individual. So anything that you learn about a culture, some of it may be useful. That's not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but much of it could only lead to stereotyping. And I think what's more important to understand is the role that having tools. So, for example, the cultural formulation interview that's oftentimes used as a way of talking to clients about their experience of culture. What does culture mean to them? How does culture affect their beliefs? So in our systems, how does culture affect your beliefs about health? How does it affect your beliefs about what helps people get better? Understanding the problems that you might be coming into services for. Those are all, plus everything else that Lenora and Nancy talked about that really cultural competence beyond that.
All right.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump because I really would love to fit in a couple of more questions if we could do that. And one that I have ready for us is from our friend Eve, and it just left. Hold on. Okay, Eve. Can you speak to the issue of class as defined by poverty? There is racism associated with poverty rather than color.
Well, CCSI conducts poverty simulations across the region. In fact, we'll be leaving the state of New York to conduct one elsewhere. And class comes up a lot because we think about the socioeconomic class and the notion of what class is, which we understand it to be a social construct in the sense where you're trying to delineate people's value and worth based on how much their income is. And in our rural communities, it seems like we've had a lot of experience of industry being such where one industry is basically holding up the entire community, and that one industry is run by one family, so and family members or friends. So that class structure is very, very much, to me, more apparent in the rural communities where your whole being, your whole culture and discrimination and how you socialize in your community impacts your ability to really fully actualize yourself in that space. And so you will experience some of those microaggressions associated, whatever they deem you to be of lesser or lower class. But we have here in our city of Rochester, we have the have and the have-nots. We talk about that all the time, but there is a clear line between those who have access, who have resources, who have finances, and those who don't. And what does that mean in creating an equitable space?
Let me give you guys the next question. Do you think it's important for practitioners to first recognize their possible biases / stigma towards the population they serve in general, and then address how oppression plays out towards particular marginalized groups? And that comes from our friend Perrin.
So there's definitely clinician bias. So I'll take the first part of that. There's definitely clinician bias. And not just clinicians. I'm going to go back to the power dynamic. So whomever it is, be it a clinician, be it a teacher, be it a supervisor, has power. And those individuals have biases. And we all have them. It is for us to acknowledge what those biases are. And the implicit ones are the ones that kind of scream out and cause the trouble. Because very often we think we have them under control, but somewhere, somehow, those implicit biases find ways to just pop out in the weirdest of places. And you kind of even say to yourself, where did that come from? Or everyone is looking at you like you have two horns. But we all have those biases. And sometimes, like if we think of a clinician, it could be the bias of the profession as well as it could be the bias of the person itself. So they both play off each other because of where we are and where we sit, and when we're dishing things out, we have to be constantly aware of who we are, what our own biases are, either from that professional perspective or from who we are as cultural beings. Be aware of them and manage them.
And I just want to add, because I think the second part of that question, if I understood it correctly, was, do you need to do that first in order to do the work of dismantling oppression and racism? And no, because I think, and Lenora addresses that nicely by saying we can never completely address our biases. It's something we just have to understand is occurring and engage in a practice of, routine self-reflection to understand it better within us. But that should never impede the actions that we need to take to dismantle racism and oppression.
With that, I want to thank our panelists. Thank you all so much. Lenora Reed-Rose, Nancy Sung-Shelton, Dr. Jim Rodriguez, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your knowledge, your expertise, and your passion. And I appreciate the passion of every one of you listening in on the webinar today. I want you all to please join us on Wednesday, March 20th. That's going to be our second webinar, and it's entitled Anti-Oppressive Practice is Good Practice. let's examine the why about anti-oppressive practice and explore how to implement it. Now, in the summer, we, NIAPR, CCSI, and the McSilver Institute have partnered with the New York State Office of Mental Health, and we will be bringing you a conference on behavioral health equity. Look out for that date. It should be coming soon. And so with that, remember, everyone, please complete your evaluations. It should be coming in your inbox. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful afternoon. And thank you, my panelists.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.